Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Between the Lines on the YouTube channel, The Brown Show. I am your host, Brown, and I created this show and I guess also this channel because I wanted to give a new perspective since there are so many out there now. And I hope that this can be a perspective that speaks to people who don't usually hear their voices in the media. So, this particular show on this channel will be to discuss headlines that we see in the media. And I find that a lot of times the media portrays stories, but they don't talk about the issues that I believe that we should talk about. Instead, they talk about things that just seem irrelevant to everyday people, or I think they missed the mark on what they should report on. So that is my hope of this show. And so basically, I read different uh, news stories from different magazines or newspapers every week and try to pick stories at random. That way, it's not always what is most important or the most serious, but try and tell a story of what society should pay attention to and basically what people find important about a lot of these issues. So I read as much as I can, and I try to pick maybe six, seven, or maybe 10 at random and go from there. So this week I picked six stories actually, and I hope you enjoy. So the first article I'm going to talk about is from an opinions column with USA Today. The piece is entitled Evan- "Evangelicals for Trump was an awful display by supporting citizens of the kingdom of God. Trump mocked his enemies, trafficked in half truths." Instilled fear, and expressed zero humility. My fellow evangelicals love every minute of it. And this was published January 11th, 2020, by a writer, John Fee. So the whole point of the article is John Fee, he talks about his personal relationship to the community of born-again Christians. And then he goes on to talk about this event that happened, I believe, 2 days prior in a Hispanic evangelical church. And they hosted Trump there. And Fee expresses how he felt that the rally was very sad due to his brothers and sisters in Christ feeding into Trump's message, which he believed was the opposite of God's teaching. And I just stumbled across this piece, and I just thought, I think he missed the mark only for the fact of he talked about this event and how, his brothers and sisters were not following in the steps of God. But one thing that I thought was so interesting was it was a Hispanic Christian church who hosted Trump. And I thought that this was so interesting because a lot of times the media will portray Trump as one of those people who will be the antithesis of the Hispanic community. And that may be true in a lot of aspects, but I think we also don't talk about the fact that there are Hispanics who agree with Trump. And I think there are more than what people tend to believe they are. And so I think it's something that we should talk about more. I think the Hispanics might actually feel as though they agree with Trump, but they will only speak about that behind closed doors. That is not something that they choose to speak about publicly for many reasons, and I think one of them is the backlash. Anyone who agrees with anything that Trump says is now labeled a racist, even if they are a racial minority. And that is something that prevents people from telling the truth about how they feel about things, which is in some instances, and I can't speak for all people, and I don't speak for myself in this, but people do agree with Trump more than you will believe, and not because they agree with the rationale of Trump, but rather they agree with the words and they have a different reason for why they agree with Trump. And so I thought that that was something very important. And then I guess the question I wanted to ask behind that was, what does this say about Trump and America? And that's a question that I'll just leave up to you viewers and see what happens next. Another point that I really wanted to raise in this is a point that has been talked about in the media, but I think has shined a negative light on things, which is, the fact that evangelicals believe in Trump. And I don't think that all of them believe in Trump for the sake of, they are racist too, because not every person in this world is racist. Now, they can be ignorant, but I don't think that every person who believes in Trump is a racist. I think that there is an appeal to Trump that speaks to the people who feel so discouraged with the American system and the promises that America made to us, well, to all people, really, and that promise not being fulfilled. And so I say in this, maybe we as a society need to re-examine, why is it that this one specific group of people who has been loyal to the Republican Party, why do they feel loyal to Donald Trump? And I can't give you an answer to that because I really do not know. But it's something for you to examine for yourself. So the next story I'm going to talk about now is actually a political piece, and it is from a publication called Truthdig. The piece is called EU Nations Push Iran in Last-Ditch Bid to Save a Nuclear Deal. It was published on January 14th, 2020. The author was not listed. It just said staff. And so this article talks about Britain, France, and Germany, 3 countries that are a part of the EU, are trying to find a way to get Iran to to be back in compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. There are 2 sides really pressuring these 3 countries in particular. So you have President Donald Trump, and he feels as though that the EU countries should abandon this deal. He cites that that the accord should be renegotiated to quote, address Iran's ballistic missile program or its regional conflicts. And then there is this other side, and Iran, and it's Iran's side, which is basically that they would be willing to roll back violations if these countries gave them more incentives to comply with the agreement. The 3 nations want to resolve this issue without putting crippling sanctions back on Iran. And the U.S. State Department actually agrees with the EU's efforts to initiate the dispute resolution mechanism. And that's basically this, what this whole piece is about, the fact that this is their last-ditch effort before sanctions come on. So Iran states in this whole situation that they only escalated the violations of the accord after the U.S. drone strike killed Qassem Soleimani. During the further violations, the EU countries invoked the dispute mechanism, which they hope will bring Iran into compliance. Iran states that the accord is no longer valid in their opinion due to the U.S. pulling out of the accord in 2018. Um, Even though Iran says this, the EU disputes that the accord is invalid, and cites that Iran still allowed inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency into their facilities, which was basically a part of the nuclear agreement, where in order for the in order for Iran to be in compliance, they had to allow this agency in to check their their nuclear arms facilities, to make sure that they were not building atomic bombs. Um, the EU hopes that the accord will be saved, but they do acknowledge that they may need the help of the U.S. To actually get Iran into compliance. Um, and so this whole article, which was very dense but very informative, it just interests me so much because there's been talks, I would say, for the last 14 days about this killing. And to be quite honest with you, I even forgot about the nuclear deal. And the fact that the U.S. media in particular did not once discuss it. At most, they discussed, the possibilities of war and everything else, but the nuclear deal was something that was never discussed, and I questioned why. Did the U.S. media forget about the deal, or was it not seen as important? Because I do find it important. Even though the U.S. government did pull out of this accord, the fact that it was a big part of Obama's legacy and something that was in the media when it was first discussed. In 2015 and even in 16, as Obama was leaving, 16 and 17, and heavily discussed in the media. So I just thought it was very interesting that it was never brought up until this decision by these three EU nations, to basically call out Iran for their noncompliance. But what I thought was also very interesting about this article was this conversation about whether the accord or the Iran nuclear deal is even valid. And I thought that it was a very interesting question because I even questioned it myself. And also, how can you expect one country to comply with an agreement when the country that brought them to the table is no longer there? And so, since the U.S. brought Iran to this deal, if the U.S. is no longer in the deal or in agreement with the deal, how exactly can you expect the country Iran to say, well, I will still stay even though the powerful country who kind of bullied me to the table is no longer there? And what I kind of thought about, like when I thought about this whole conversation, I thought about tort law. And I can only speak for America when it comes to this type of law, but also the UK, because most of U.S. Common law it was built off of UK law. So I guess one of the countries involved in this, in the one of the EU countries involved in the nuclear agreement can really ask themselves this. But one particular tort law states that if three or more parties enter into an agreement, when one party pulls out of that agreement, the agreement is void for all parties unless the other parties renegotiate the terms. And so I state this because the U.S. pulled out of this agreement, and the other countries that were still in the agreement never renegotiated. And so I question, how would you know that the agreement still stood? And it's a question that I wonder, why didn't the other countries governments ask themselves, like, is this still a valid agreement? And the fact that no one communicated, I mean, how can you expect someone to comply with something if you never talk to them after um, a lapse and an agreement? And so that was something that I questioned. And why would other countries assume that this agreement still stood if a party backed out? Especially when the party who convinced Iran to come to the table pulled out. So I just thought that, the media never addressed, this whole idea. And it wasn't until Iran specifically said something about the pulling out of the U.S. And now this whole conversation about compliance, that we're now having this conversation about what would be the legacy of Iran. Well, not of Iran, but this Iran nuclear deal. And what does this deal really mean for the U.S. and for other countries? Because, as it was stated in 2015, Iran's nuclear program could become a problem. And so if this was a concern then and still a concern now, how is it that highly intelligent people who run governments did not even think that a disruption in this agreement would not cause issues? And so I leave it up to that. And then I'll move on to my next story. So my next story, it's one under nation, like the category of nation, but it's mainly U.S. And this is actually from USA Today, so another article from them. And it's entitled, Texas School Board Starts New Age of Understanding, Drops Confederate Song Dixie After Years of Criticism. This article was written January 14th, 2020, and it was written by Vicky Camarlio. And so this article talks about a school district in Texas had this song entitled Dixie, or I Wish I Was in Dixieland, as its theme song. And I can't believe that school districts actually have theme songs, but nonetheless, this song was the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. And after several months of the Board of Trustees meeting, people being called racist, and many emotional pleas, the Board of Trustees finally voted to stop using this particular song. And so I just have so many thoughts and opinions on this whole issue, and the fact that it is an issue surprises me a little bit. I think one is the fact that in this whole article, it was just this thing about people pleading to, never use the song, and it was agreed upon. But I think one thing that was missing in this whole conversation was an acknowledgement of the time in which this song was written. I mean, the article addressed it, but I don't think the people of this district truly addressed it. And I mean this in a way of us acknowledging what history was and being aware that we should educate for newer generations of a lot of the historical context of these songs. I mean, I don't know if third graders know the true significance of what happened during the Civil War or what this song really means. And I mean that for not only people who are white, but also Black. And so the fact that we're kind of not discussing this in terms of what this song is, what it represents, in a way it allows people to get rid of the past, but it doesn't remind us of the ignorance that we once all participated in. And it really does feel ignorance in the end. because we don't acknowledge the past. Instead, we sweep it under the rug. We say, that was in the past, but people fail to realize that uh, history is cyclical. And so once something happens, if it's never addressed, it will go around in that track over and over and over again. And I think that this article kind of sparks conversations about, well, to me, about the Confederate monuments. This discussion that I think happened maybe 2 or 3 years ago about what should we as a country do with a lot of the Confederate monuments. And people's idea was, let's just take it down and burn it. And I thought that that was very ignorant to do, only for the sake of, when you sit there and you try to delete the past, you no longer have tools to educate people. And I think sometimes when people feel uncomfortable about the past, things that have happened, even though you never participated in, maybe ancestors have, people feel as though they now have to defend themselves. And I don't think that that should be a thing, because it wasn't your actions, but it was your ancestors' actions. But I think that there is this emphasis on, if something happened that my ancestors participated in, I'm just as guilty. And it shouldn't be a thing like that. But I do think that, when we think about that and the Confederate monuments specifically, I thought that this story was very similar to the Confederate monuments. And I think even more of this conversation that we're having now about Disney Plus, where we talk about movies that were created once upon a time, and there are some racially ignorant portrayals in these movies, and some people's idea of fixing the problem was to just rewrite the scenes over. And I thought that that is basically erasing history. I mean, these movies were successful. They might have made people feel uncomfortable, myself included at times. But the point is that that was a sign of the times then. It is not a reflection on who we are as a nation today. And so to try and erase something because you feel uncomfortable, I find is wrong, especially when that helps us to understand the history that once was. And then the other thing, I will move on to my second point about this, was there was a point in the article when people were being called racist. And I thought it was so interesting that people were more offended about being called racist than being racist. And I think that that is something so interesting. The word racist has become a fuel in a way, like to invoke fear in people. And so people feel as though if they're labeled a racist, not because they actually are they're deserving of that title, but because they just feel as though it is wrong. And I mean, sometimes is the word racist weaponized? Absolutely. Just like any other word, feminist is, not feminist, but misogynist is weaponized at times. Homophobic is weaponized at times. And so I do understand that racist, the word racist can be weaponized. But with that said, the fact that, people don't even examine the things that can be considered racist is very interesting, and something that, we as a society need to look more closely at about are the things that we are doing can be considered offensive or racist. But I think there's more racism, but I think there's more ignorance than racism in the world. And I think that we also need to define racism versus ignorance. And I mean, I can't give you a clinical definition of either one of them, but I think one thing that we need to make a distinction with racism is that, number one, it's about hatred, and number two, it's about oppression. And so if both things are not included, That does not mean that you're still not ignorant, but to just consider, oh, that is racist, I think that's a conversation that we need to look more closely at. I guess my fourth story for today is under the category of celebrities. And this piece is also from USA Today. And this piece is entitled Time's Up Activist Release Guide to Deal with Misconduct in Hollywood, Avoid Hotel Room Meetings. And it was written on January 3rd, 2020, so it's a little bit earlier than the other pieces. And it was written by Maria Punta. And so basically the whole point of this article was to basically release Time's Up Foundation released the guide with the kickoff of the award season to help address some issues that have been going on in Hollywood. So they wanted to address or put out a guide to help people understand how to deal with auditions or nude or intimate scenes and reporting sexual harassment or misconduct. And it was a pretty straightforward piece, but as I was reading it, I did start to get, like a little I think that we have truly missed the conversation that we should have had. And one of these things I would say is the fact that the guidelines seem to be more for actresses instead of all women within the Hollywood industry. The fact that they addressed auditions or Hollywood auditions or nude or intimate scenes speaks to basically one demographic within Hollywood instead of many demographics. There are female crew members, there are secretaries, assistants, etc. And really, the guide never addressed that at all. And I think this also, it shows something that I think we don't talk about enough when we address the Me Too movement, which is that it does not represent everyone. It represents a certain group or demographic of women. And I think the Me Too movement represents women who are already in power. But to be quite honest with you, the sexual harassment, even though, it does happen to women in power, it's more about taking control and using your power to intimidate other people in sexual ways. And so with that understanding in mind, how is it that we don't address the most vulnerable people who I think experience sexual harassment even more than actresses? If you think about a lot of the cases that have won, that have been in the courts, victims suing employers for sexual harassments, it's usually the secretaries. It's usually, the cleaning lady who's experiencing this more. But yet and still a foundation whose whole objective is to defend women does not address all women's issues. They address one issue. And so I go on to say, in this case, what does this really mean? Like, is the Me Too movement really for all people, or is it for certain demographics? And when I think about this, I think about historically how women's movements have always been. I guess for me, I'm not a big fan to talk about race all the time, but if I look at, the voting movement for women, first wave feminism, second wave feminism, there were minority women who were at the front of a lot of these movements to get it to a place where it could make real change. However, these women were pushed to the back, and it became a movement about one demographic and one demographic only, white women. And I'm not here to preach about that at all, but just to say that these women who became the forefront of all of these movements were white middle-class women, middle to upper class women. But yet and still, other groups, basically the disenfranchised groups, were never represented in a lot of these movements, or if they were always in the back. And it seems like this is the same case where these women, want the same rights. They don't want to be sexually harassed more than any other group, but these disenfranchised women are not seen and they're not heard. And that's a real problem. And I mean, to say the fact that this whole Me Too movement was started by a Black woman, and yet and still a lot of her people, if you will, Black women, are not represented in this movement. And that is very, very sad. But I mean, I do understand that, as I said before in the earlier article, this whole idea about how history is cyclical, and in a way, we see history being repeated. And it's a very sad thing, but it should be something that we address, not just with sitting someone of color on a board, but rather talking about how every movement, and not just women's movements, but every movement, has used Black and brown bodies to get their agenda across. But while using those Black and brown bodies, they still made them feel marginalized. And that's a very, very sad thing. But I will digress from that point, and I will move on to another point. And this is another opinion article. And this is also from USA Today. It does seem like I have picked all USA Today articles, but it just so happens that they all fell. They're all about USA Today. But this piece is entitled DJ Duncan Hiring Shows Coaches Care More About Each Other Than Players. It was written January 2nd, 2020, and it was written by Dan Wolken. Please forgive me if I don't pronounce any of these things correctly. But in this article, it talks about how an Ole Miss athletic director hires former Maryland football coach DJ Duncan. Maybe if you do know, or maybe if you don't know, DJ Duncan was fired in 2018 after he was being investigated for the death of a player or member of his football team who passed away during a practice due to a heat stroke and allegedly a toxic work environment. And there are many horrid allegations about a lot of the things he would do, such as, make some of his players watch videos of serial killers and things of that nature. The college football coaches within like all of these colleges sing Duncan's praise, despite many horrid allegations from the Maryland football team. Wolken raises the point that the coach has political capital that allows him to get away with bad behavior. And with players afraid of losing their scholarships, they will not say much. And so just basically telling people about this incident and how, this man's firing for allegations that are very troubling still did not mean anything to other colleges when they decided to hire him. And what I thought about this article was that, number one, money does allow for cover-ups. One thing about sports teams, especially D1 sports teams, is the fact that they bring in a whole lot of money. And we're not just talking about thousands of dollars, we're talking about millions of dollars. And so that allows a whole lot of cover-ups when it comes to, recruitment practices, when it comes to issues that players might be involved in, um, and things of that nature, and how universities will cover it up. I think another thing is how universities will turn a blind eye to issues that go on their campus, um, and this is a prime example how Maryland did it. Even though the allegations are horrid, it took them a very long time to fire this man. And other colleges still decided to hire him. Not just Ole Miss, but there were other colleges that hired him prior to this hiring. And this actually reminded me of Penn State. And just, the whole incident with Jerry Sandusky, how this man was abusing boys at his camp. And officials knew at Penn State. They knew about this man's behavior, but they did and said nothing. I think also about the Penn State's frat hazing issue that they have, and the fact that students have died on Penn State's campus. And Penn State will only address it when it's addressed in the media. That's a very sad thing. And the fact that nobody seems to talk about it. I mean, that, or particularly a lot of things that go on campuses. And it's a very sad thing, but I think that it happens because if you think about it, universities are million, sometimes $billion institutes. And when you have that type of money and very little oversight, if you think about it, it's a university police in itself. So what exactly can you expect when the people who are in power are also policing themselves? Very little gets done. And the people who end up suffer in silence because, as I said before, money covers up things. So money can buy silence. Money can buy a whole lot of things. And so people end up getting messed up in ways that, is so sad. But it happens all the time. And we don't discuss it. As a society, we don't. We turn a blind eye to it. And that's just something I can never understand. And then the last point on this one I wanted to talk about was college sports players and what they are entitled to. As I said before, a lot of college sports teams, they make billions of dollars, billions. And even though that is the case, these players, all they receive are scholarships, probably free meals during the year, but that's it. I mean, how exactly can a university make millions of dollars and these players might only see probably $1 million in scholarships and food, and that's about it. That is about it. And so I think that we should have a discussion about what exactly can we do for players where they can keep their heads above water while in college, because college is expensive. It is truly expensive. And a lot of these players who are playing sports, they are playing it because they love it, but also because they're trying to find better lives for themselves, because the circumstances that they're probably in at home are not great ones. So you have men basically making decisions for their whole family, and it's not like they can do much for their families now. And I think a part of it, a thing that I see a lot, is the fact that a lot of these players go pro before they graduate. And they do that because it's not like the NCAA is paying them. And so they need to find ways to support their family when these colleges aren't. And so I guess the question I just want to pose and leave it at this is, what are college sports players entitled to? And it's up to you to decide. The last article I will talk about is from the CNN Travel, and it is about travel. It's entitled "Why Michelin Chefs Are Handing Back Their Stars." It was written January 14th, 2020 by Fran, Francesca Street. And the whole point of this article was just about how chefs, it starts off with basically the whole idea of Michelin stars, and the what do chefs gain by gaining Michelin stars, and it talks about how basically a lot of chefs who are Michelin chefs, they end up quitting their restaurant, shutting them down, and basically move into smaller areas where they can uh, where they can. The last article that I'm going to talk about is from CNN Travel, and it is about travel. The piece is entitled "Why Michelin Chefs Are Handing Back Their Stars." It was written January 14th, 2020 by Francesca Street. The whole point of this article was to talk about first what is a Michelin chef, and then it talked about how a lot of these Michelin chefs are either closing down restaurants, they're Michelin star restaurants, and opening up shop with smaller, more cafe style restaurants, or how they're either suing Michelin for not giving them stars or giving them stars or handing back a lot of their stars. And I thought that this was a very troubling piece, but it was also interesting only for the sake of the. When I think about Michelin stars, I think about the fact that these people are at the top of their fields. I mean, if you think about it, Michelin stars allows for doors to be opened for you and your restaurant. You become a top chef and all of this, and people are willingly giving that back. And the article cited for the giving back of these stars or closing down these restaurants is the fact that a lot of these chefs are burnt out. And I thought that it was so troubling as a young person trying to find my way is the fact that trying to find my way and trying to work and grind and all of that to become a top person in my field, and to know that if I get there, I might be just so burnt out that I don't want to be there anymore. And that is a very scary thought for me. And it made me think about society in general, how we push for excellence. You know, you want to be the best, you want to be the greatest, and we never talk about the cost of being great. What do people have to give up to be great? Does that mean that you don't see your family as much? Does that mean that you might not be able to have a family of your own? Does that mean that you miss out on moments that will be important to you later on in life? And I know that there are sacrifices. Like, as an adult, you just have to make sacrifices. But the question I ask, and I think this article in a way address, and these chefs do, is what sacrifice is too much of a sacrifice? And I think that that's a very important question that we don't ask in society. And this thought that I do ask myself all the time: if I were on my deathbed, what would be the last thing I say? And I know that the last thing will not be I did not work enough or I did not work hard enough. I know it'll probably be something like I wish I spent more time with my family. And so it makes me wonder, in society, how hard are we working, and how much are we putting an emphasis on excellence that we don't take the time to realize that there's more to life than work. I mean, work is great. Um, and and I love what I do. But is there a point where I love it so much that I don't take the time to love me or the people around me, or to appreciate the people around me? Because, to be quite honest with you, they won't be here forever, neither will I. And so in this short little life that I have, you know, will I do everything I truly wanted to do? And the fact that these chefs are realizing that, and that there is a whole lot of pressure in life. So why put more on you? I mean, that's a very um, pertinent question that we don't ask enough. And I mean, the fact that um, CNN decided to highlight this. I mean, I know it wasn't one of their top pieces, but I think it's an important piece in a conversation that I think we should have more often. And so that's where I want to leave today's show. The question of when is too much? Or when is a lot too much? And so I will leave it there. So now that this show is over, and I know that there's a lot of ums and mispronunciations and going over words, and I just did it right now too. I want to get better at this, and since this is my first episode, I know that I will. I know that this is a very long video, and I will try to be a little shorter with it, and I will try to hone in on my crafts. But I want to thank all of you out there who may or may not be listening to this. I truly enjoyed my time, and I hope that this series or show or podcast, whatever you may call it, will grow into something, because I know it can. I know that this can be a really great thing. And I will say thank you very much. And I shall see you next week or the week after. Not pretty sure yet, but thank you in the meantime. And I am signing off.